Loud music, flashing lights and the sound of laughter filled the room as I entered the party. The surprise at my arrival was planned, a gesture to honor her efforts and share that moment that was supposed to mean so much. But what I found as I walked through the doors was the kind of scene that turns your heart to ice and breaks your soul into 1,000 pieces. My gaze found her in the corner of the hall, laughing, illuminated, but not by me. He was next to her, very close, with a discreet hand rubbing her back, while she tilted her head in his direction, her lips curved in a smile that was no longer mine. The world around me began to spin slowly, every sound and every face blurring as that scene settled before me like a cruel portrait. I approached, steps firm, every inch of me aflame with indignation. When she saw me, her face fell apart in a mixture of shock and awe. "No. Not here," she muttered, raising her hands as if she could erase what I had just witnessed. He, the man who dared to step on what we had built, froze in place, trying to gauge my intentions as sweat began to bead on his brow. "It's over," I declared, my voice cutting through the air like a sharp blow. There was no room for explanations, for excuses, for a ridiculous theater of regret. Everything I needed to know was already in front of me, imprinted in his terrified eyes and in the hands that sought an embarrassed distance from that man. The silence around me was overwhelming for a moment, before I turned and left. But it wasn't just the party I'd left behind. It was everything. The years, the promises, the shared plans, everything seemed to crumble beneath my feet as I crossed that hall. The air felt heavy, full of unanswered questions. How many times? How long ago? And, most devastatingly, why? At home, the echo of the party was still ringing in my ears. The loneliness weighed on me, but it was the absolute silence that crushed me. Every piece of furniture, every framed photo, everything seemed to mock me, reminding me of a past that was now a lie. However, as I tried to process the pain, another question began to emerge, more insidious, more treacherous. Was he just another one? Were there other secrets buried in those seemingly solid years? I had no answers, but I was determined to find out. Because, deep down, what hurt me most was not the act itself, but the possibility that my whole life had been built on a sandcastle. The next morning, a small detail changed everything. Something she hadn't planned, something she never thought I would notice. And that's when I realized that what I saw at the party wasn't just a betrayal. It was the beginning of a much darker game than I could have predicted. What I found out later left me facing a choice I never imagined I would have to make. A choice that would change our lives, and his, forever. And yet there was something even bigger, a secret waiting in the shadows, ready to emerge and transform the whole story into something far beyond what I could bear. Welcome to the canal. We don't tolerate any kind of betrayal here. All the stories presented are fictional, created to show how infidelity can destroy lives and leave deep scars. Our aim is to bring reflection and intense emotions, revealing the devastating impacts that wrong choices can have. Get ready now to hear a shocking story, full of twists and turns and strong emotions. Good story. The atmosphere was serene most of the time, a modest but carefully organized house, reflecting the joint effort of years of work and dedication. Lucas and Clara were a couple who, at first glance, seemed to have everything under control. He, with his calm and methodical attitude, worked in a technology company, where his ability to solve problems made him respected by his colleagues. Clara, on the other hand, was a radiant presence, a marketing manager whose energy and charisma lit up any environment. The two had met at a corporate event almost a decade ago. Lucas, with his discreet humor and observant gaze, had immediately been charmed by Clara's spontaneity. She, always full of stories and laughter, saw in Lucas a stability she had never found in anyone else. They were different in many ways, but that difference seemed to be the glue that bound them together. Clara brought the freshness and lightness that Lucas needed, while he provided her with a safe haven amidst the storms of everyday life. Their life was consolidated into a routine that seemed satisfactory to both of them. On weekdays, Clara would leave early for work, usually dressed impeccably, her distinctive perfume echoing through the house. Lucas had a habit of getting up later and preparing breakfast for her, a simple gesture, but one full of meaning. It was his way of taking care of her, of showing that, even in the smallest details, he was there. At weekends, the scene changed. They used to get lost in long conversations, often accompanied by glasses of wine in the small garden at home. They would talk about future plans, trips they would like to take, and even the dog they would one day adopt. It was in these moments that their complicity was at its strongest, a partnership that seemed unbreakable. Despite this, there was a slight imbalance that Lucas was beginning to notice. Clara seemed increasingly distant at times, wrapped up in thoughts that she didn't share. He, pragmatic as he was, attributed this to the stress of work. Clara had mentioned an important project at the company, something that could determine her career progression. Lucas believed that, in time, everything would return to normal. On the other side, Clara was dealing with a whirlwind of emotions. There were days when she felt suffocated by routine, as if the glow she had once felt alongside Lucas had slowly faded. But she also knew that real life was no fairy tale. There was love, that was undeniable, but the warmth of the beginning seemed to have given way to a lukewarm stability. And while Lucas seemed comfortable with this calm, Clara missed something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The couple's friends saw them as an example. "You're so balanced," they often said. Lucas accepted the compliments with a shy smile, while Clara silently felt a twinge of doubt. Were they really as aligned as they seemed? Or had they just learned to play the part of a perfect couple? One day, Clara mentioned the company's annual party, an event that brought together employees, clients, and partners. She seemed excited, detailing the decorations, the theme, and even the dress she had chosen for the occasion. Lucas, for his part, had planned to stay at home that night. He wasn't a fan of crowds and preferred to enjoy the tranquility of his living room. Even so, when Clara smiled at him and insisted, he shook his head and said that this time he would rather let her shine alone. On the evening of the event, Clara looked radiant as she finished getting ready. Lucas, watching her from the sofa, felt a mixture of pride and admiration. He knew she was the star wherever she went, and part of him felt content just to witness that glow. "Have fun," he said, as Clara walked out the door, blowing him a kiss. But as the hours passed, a restlessness began to grow in Lucas. He tried to distract himself with a movie, but his mind wandered. Something about the way Clara had talked about the event, the way she seemed too excited, bothered him. It wasn't jealousy, or so he told himself. It was just a feeling. Around 10 o'clock at night, he decided he needed to see her. Perhaps it was just to confirm that everything was fine, that his insecurities were unfounded. He quickly got ready, grabbed his car keys and set off in the direction of the party venue. When he arrived, Lucas was greeted by the vibrant sound of the music and the lights illuminating the hall. People were scattered around, dancing, laughing and chatting. He felt a little out of place, but decided he just had to find Clara. She would be surprised, maybe even happy, to see him there. As he walked through the hall, something began to change. Small details, an exchange of glances here, a whisper there, began to shape a scenario that Lucas didn't want to face. He tried to ignore it, to focus only on finding Clara, but what he saw when he finally located her was something that could never be erased from his mind. And in that instant, what had seemed like a solid, unshakable love story began to crumble, stone by stone. Lucas walked through the hall, trying to ignore the sound of the loud music and the blinding glare of the lights. Each step seemed heavier, as if something was warning him to stop, to go home and forget that urge to come. But he couldn't. Something inside him, an unsettling feeling he couldn't explain, was pulling him forward, insisting that he had to find Clara. He spotted familiar faces, her work colleagues who just greeted him with warm smiles, while some looked more uncomfortable than he expected. Clara had always said that she was admired by many in the company, and he didn't doubt that. But now, as he observed his surroundings, he noticed glances that seemed to avoid him, as if his presence there disturbed something. His unease increased. Passing the bar, Lucas stopped for a moment, as if his body was looking for an excuse not to go any further. He ordered a glass of water and looked around for any sign of Clara. Her red dress wouldn't be hard to find, especially with her vibrant manner. However, no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't see her. He felt out of place, almost an intruder in that place where Clara seemed so at ease. After a few minutes, he finally decided to head towards a more secluded area of the hall, where heavy curtains blocked out some of the sound. He passed groups chatting quietly, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. Something was wrong, he could feel it. As he turned down a corridor, he heard voices. They weren't just laughter or casual conversations. They were whispers, mixed with something that seemed more intimate, a complicity that immediately caught his attention. His breathing quickened as he approached, his steps slow and calculated, as if he didn't want to be overheard. When he finally reached the end of the corridor, Lucas stopped. His hands were shaking, and he felt his chest tighten in a way he had never experienced before. There stood Clara, in a darker corner, next to a man he didn't recognize. The man was leaning towards her, and the way the two of them were close left little room for interpretation. Lucas watched, motionless, as if his body was frozen. Clara was laughing, but it wasn't the light, spontaneous laughter he knew so well. It was more restrained, almost furtive, as if she knew she shouldn't be there, but couldn't help it. The man, on the other hand, seemed confident, touching her arm in a casual but clearly intimate way. He felt his blood boil, but at the same time a wave of disbelief paralyzed him. Was this it? Was what was happening in front of his eyes exactly what he had feared? Or was he misreading the situation? The questions in his mind swirled unanswered as he forced himself to keep watching. Clara finally noticed him. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, as if she had been caught red-handed. The man next to her looked at Lucas, confused for a moment, before noticing the tension in the air. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Lucas didn't need to hear anything at that moment. He already knew. The scene seemed to drag on in slow motion. Clara tried to pull herself together, straightening her dress and desperately searching for something to say. "Lucas, what are you doing here?" she finally asked, her voice shaky but trying to sound casual. He didn't answer straight away. He just looked at her, and then at the man, who now looked uncomfortable, as if he were looking for a way out. "I came, because I thought it was the place I was supposed to be," Lucas finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I guess I was wrong." Clara took a step towards him, but he held up his hand, asking her to stop. "Don't say anything now," he continued. "I think I need some time to process what I've seen." He turned and began to walk away, leaving Clara standing there, visibly shaken, while the man simply retreated into the shadows, as if he would rather disappear. As Lucas left the hall, he felt a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief at finally understanding what was wrong, but devastation at the confirmation of his worst fears. He drove home in silence, the thoughts echoing like a drum in his mind. He knew that night would change everything. What he didn't know yet was how deep the abyss really was. Arriving home, Lucas went inside, leaving the lights off. He sat on the sofa, staring at the emptiness. It wasn't just the betrayal that devastated him, but the feeling that something else was hidden beneath the surface, something he hadn't yet discovered. As the dawn progressed, the question that echoed in his mind was not just what Clara had done, but why. And more importantly, what would he do now? The silence in the house was overwhelming, filled only by the sound of the clock ticking away the minutes with almost cruel precision. Lucas was sitting on the sofa, his eyes fixed on the emptiness. He hadn't slept. The encounter at the party and Clara's expression still burned in his mind like a red-hot iron. He felt like his whole world was falling apart, but he knew he needed answers. What he saw that night was only the beginning of something he still couldn't fully understand. The sound of the door opening caught his attention. Clara entered the room with hesitant steps, her red dress now wrinkled and her hair messy. Her face was marked by tension, and her eyes showed a night as long as his. "Lucas," she began, but her voice failed her. He remained silent, watching her, the weight of his presence demanding more than a simple attempt at an apology. "I need you to tell the truth, Clara," he said, his voice firm but laden with pain. "I don't want excuses, I don't want lies. Just the truth." She hesitated, looking at him as if searching for some spark of forgiveness in his gaze. But she found nothing but a man determined to face whatever was necessary. "I don't know how to start," Clara said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I never wanted you to find out like this." "So you confirm?" Lucas interrupted, standing up. His height, normally a protective gesture, now seemed like an insurmountable barrier between the two of them. "Is that exactly what it looked like? A betrayal?" Clara lowered her head, unable to hold his gaze. "Yes," she admitted, and the word hung in the air like a final blow. "But it's not that simple." Lucas laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh, only bitterness. "It never is it? There's always an explanation that somehow lessens the weight of what you've done. So tell me, Clara, what makes it so complicated?" She took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage for something much bigger. "Lucas, I made a mistake, yes. But the man you saw at the party, he's not just a colleague. He's my boss." Lucas blinked, processing the information. "Your boss," he repeated, the tone of his voice mixing incredulity and anger. "Are you saying that you've decided to throw away everything we've built for someone who controls your career? Is that it?" Clara shook her head, her eyes watering. "That's not how it started. I was frustrated, feeling invisible. He came along at a time when I was vulnerable. He gave me attention, validated things I missed, and you chose to cheat. Let's call a spade, Clara." "You cheated," Lucas said, cutting her off. But there was something else in his expression now, something beyond anger. It was as if he was trying to understand, as if he wanted to put together the pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. "He's not just my boss, Lucas," she continued, her voice breaking. "He's also involved me in something I should never have allowed." "Something like what?" Lucas's voice was lower now, but charged with intensity. Clara took a deep breath, finally raising her gaze to him. "He convinced me to use our joint accounts to finance a project. A project which, I later discovered, was completely fraudulent." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas looked at her, the anger and hurt in his eyes giving way to something darker. "You put our money into this?" "I didn't know, Lucas," she pleaded. "He told me it was a safe opportunity, something that would benefit us in the long run. But it was a lie. I was an idiot, and now he's blackmailing me." Lucas took a step back, as if he needed room to breathe. "Blackmail?" he repeated, his tone now cold. "Not only did you betray me, but you also put our future at risk, and now you're stuck with this man?" Clara nodded, the tears finally streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do. I wanted to tell you before, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing you, afraid of facing the consequences." "He has proof, Lucas. Messages, documents. He said that if I don't stay by his side, he'll destroy everything." Lucas closed his eyes, trying to process the whirlwind of information. He felt a mixture of hatred, pain and a strange need to act. "And you think I'm going to stand by while he does this?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. "Do you think I'm going to let this man destroy my life and yours without a fight?" Clara sobbed. I didn't know what else to do." Lucas walked to the door, pausing for a moment before leaving. "You destroyed so much of what we had, Clara. But I'm not going to let that man control what's left. I'll find a way to deal with it, with or without your help." He left, leaving Clara alone in the room, the weight of his actions finally falling on her. She knew she had crossed a line from which she might never be able to return. But what terrified her most was the determination in Lucas' eyes. Because, deep down, she knew that the secret she was hiding was even bigger than everything she had revealed so far. And when Lucas found out, nothing would ever be the same again. Lucas drove aimlessly, the steering wheel firmly in his hands as his mind swirled with revelations. The weight of what he had heard from Clara seemed to crush him. He parked in an empty lot, the silence of the night enveloping him like a suffocating blanket. He sat on the bench of a small bandstand, the cold air stinging his skin as he tried to organize his thoughts. The betrayal alone was devastating, but the scope of Clara's actions was something he still couldn't fully comprehend. As he stared into the void, the sound of soft footsteps on the gravel brought his attention back. He looked up to see Clara approaching, her arms crossed as if to protect herself not only from the cold, but from the emotional storm that was enveloping them. She stopped a few steps away, hesitating, as if waiting for his permission to approach. "How did you find me?" Lucas asked, his voice low but firm. "I knew you'd come here," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "You always come when you need to think." Lucas said nothing. He just stared at the horizon again, his eyes fixed on the trees swaying in the wind. "I'm not going to run away from this, Lucas," Clara continued, taking a seat on the bench but keeping a respectful distance. "I know what I've done is unforgivable. But please, let me try to make amends." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Make amends? Clara, do you understand the gravity of what you've done? It's not just about you and me. You've put our whole lives at risk because of, what? A little attention? From someone who made you feel special?" "I know," she replied, tears silently streaming down her face. "I know I was wrong. But I was manipulated, Lucas." He knew exactly what to say, how to act. "I was vulnerable, and he took advantage of that." "And you let him," Lucas retorted, finally turning to face her. "You chose to. It wasn't a moment of weakness, Clara. It was one decision after another that brought us here." Clara lowered her head, unable to hold his gaze. "You're right. But now I need to be strong. I need to put right what I've done." "And how do you intend to do that?" Lucas asked, the anger in his voice now mixed with an icy skepticism. "How are you going to stand up to someone who already controls you, who has the evidence to destroy not only you, but also me?" She took a deep breath, raising her eyes to meet his. "I have something against him." Lucas narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher what she meant. "What are you hiding, Clara?" She hesitated, the words weighing on her tongue. "I've discovered something about him. Something that could turn the tide." "Are you talking about more lies, Clara? Or is this time the truth?" Lucas challenged, his patience rapidly waning. "It's the truth," Clara replied firmly. "He used the money that we put into that project to finance something illegal. It's not just ordinary fraud, Lucas. It's money laundering. I discovered it recently, and he knows I'm aware of it." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions. "And you only tell me this now? After everything?" "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "Afraid you'd hate me, afraid he'd do something against us. But now I see that hiding it only made it worse." Lucas stood up, pacing back and forth as he processed the new information. "So he's not just blackmailing you. He's using you as a shield, as an accomplice to cover up his own crimes." Clara nodded, the tears falling harder. "I should never have gotten involved with him, Lucas. But now, if we expose this, he can be destroyed. And we can also free ourselves." Lucas stopped, staring at her intensely. "Do you have proof?" She hesitated, but finally shook her head. "I have some emails, records. Nothing that's enough to incriminate him completely, but it's a start. And I know where he keeps the rest. Lucas took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of anger and determination. Then let's get everything. Let's finish him off before he destroys us. Are you going to help me? Clara asked, surprised by the change in his posture. Lucas stared at her for a long moment. I'm not doing this for you, Clara. I'm doing it because he won't ruin my life. You've already done enough for that. Clara lowered her head again, accepting his words as the weight of her choices. I understand. And I thank you all the same. They spent the night planning their next move. Clara revealed details about the man's habits, the places where he kept important documents, and how they could access them without arousing suspicion. Lucas listened carefully, his mind now focused on a single goal, regaining control of his life. When morning came, they set off together, each carrying their own demons. Clara knew that their relationship might never be the same, but at that moment, her only concern was facing the man who had become the darkest shadow of her marriage. And Lucas, as he drove towards the uncertain future, felt a strength he had never experienced before, the strength of someone willing to fight for justice, even if it meant leaving parts of himself behind. What lay ahead was something neither of them could fully predict. But they both knew that, one way or another, everything would be decided that night. The plan was put together with precision, but fraught with tension. Lucas and Clara went into action with a mixture of determination and nervousness. They both knew there was no room for error. The night was dark, and the silence that hung over the car during the journey was almost as heavy as the thoughts that raged in each of their minds. Clara wondered if Lucas would ever forgive her. Lucas, on the other hand, was fighting the need to stay focused, even with the anger still throbbing in his chest. When they arrived at the location, a discreet office house on a deserted street, Clara pointed out the place where she believed the documents were kept. It was a building with a neutral facade and no signs of nocturnal activity. He has a room on the second floor, she explained, her voice low. The files are probably in the locked cabinet next to the desk. Lucas scrutinized the entrance. Are you sure he won't be here? He asked, his suspicion evident. Yes, Clara replied. He usually uses this place during the day. At night, he prefers to meet elsewhere. But we need to be quick. Lucas nodded, although every fiber of his being was on alert. They parked the car in a nearby alleyway, hidden from the few streetlights, and walked to the entrance. Clara shivered slightly, not just from the cold of the night, but from a mixture of anxiety and fear. Lucas led the way, his posture tense but firm. The front door was locked, as expected, but Clara pulled a small key from her handbag. I took this when he was distracted, she said, almost as a confession. Lucas didn't reply, but took the key and used it to open the door. The click of the mechanism echoed in the stillness of the street. As they entered, the smell of old paper and wood enveloped them. Clara led Lucas up the stairs to the second floor, each step echoing softly on the worn carpet. When they reached the office, Clara pointed to the cupboard she had mentioned. It's over there. But he might have changed the password on the lock. Lucas wasted no time. He picked up the lock, looked at it for a moment, and started trying combinations. He had a natural ability to solve problems and, after a few failed attempts, the lock finally opened. At the same time, Clara began rummaging through drawers and folders scattered around the room, looking for anything that might be useful. Look at this, said Lucas, holding up a thick envelope with the logo of an unknown company. He opened the envelope and found a series of documents that, while not expert, made clear the complexity of the scheme they were involved in. There were suspicious bank transfers, contracts with misleading clauses and even records directly linking Clara's boss to offshore accounts. That's more than enough to expose everything, Lucas said, his eyes fixed on the papers. But we need to make sure he doesn't hit us before we can use it. I know where he keeps digital copies, Clara added, a tone of urgency in her voice. If we don't take either, he'll still have the means to control us. They continued the search for another half-hour, each discovery bringing a mixture of relief and concern. Lucas was impressed by the extent of the man's illegal activities. "He's not just a corrupt boss," he muttered. "He's a criminal on a level that goes far beyond what I imagined." As they worked, the distant sound of a car parking in the street caught Lucas's attention. He gestured for Clara to be quiet and switched off the light in the room. Through a crack in the shutter, he saw a man getting out of the car. It was Clara's boss. "What's he doing here at this hour?" Clara whispered, her voice filled with panic. "Maybe he suspected something," Lucas replied, already thinking of how to escape without being discovered. The man entered the building, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Lucas pulled Clara behind a tall bookcase, gesturing for her to be quiet. Their hearts were racing, and the silence was now oppressive. Clara's boss entered the room, turned on the light and began rummaging through papers on the table. He looked nervous, as if he knew something was wrong. As he turned towards the cupboard, Lucas realized that it would be impossible to avoid a confrontation. Without a second thought, Lucas stood up, keeping his posture firm. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm but laden with tension. The man froze, surprise clear on his face. "Lucas? What are you doing here?" Clara?" He looked at her, who was now also coming out from behind the bookcase. "It's over," Lucas said, raising the papers he was holding. "We know everything. And you're not going to go through with it." The boss laughed, but the sound was hollow, almost desperate. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Do you think these documents are enough? I can finish you off before you can do anything." "Maybe," Lucas replied, taking a step forward. "But now we have something on you. And we're not going to stop until we make sure your mask falls off." The man took a step towards the table, trying to grab something, but Lucas was quicker, blocking his movement. "I'm not like Clara," he said, his voice now as cold as ice. "I won't bend to your threats." Clara, though trembling, found the strength in herself to add, "And I'm no longer the person you manipulated. You no longer have control over me." The boss realized he was at a disadvantage. He stepped back, his eyes narrowed. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice full of venom. "I can still destroy you. Don't forget that." Lucas held the man's gaze, his determination unwavering. "Try," he challenged. "But know that, this time, we're ready." The man left, but not without casting one last threatening glance. Clara collapsed on the floor as soon as he was gone, her tears finally coming to the surface. Lucas helped her up, his touch now gentler, though still charged with an emotional distance. "We need to get out of here," he said. "And make sure that what we have is delivered to the right people." Clara nodded, realizing that the journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope, even if it meant facing the judgment of Lucas and everyone else she had let down. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Lucas and Clara worked together to gather all the evidence against her boss, handing over the documents and emails to a specialized investigation team. It was a slow and exhausting process, but Lucas didn't allow anything to distract him from his goal. Clara, for her part, was going through a roller coaster of emotions. The shame of her actions consumed her, but she knew that the only way she could try to redeem herself was to face the consequences and do what was right. As the investigations began to progress, Clara's boss was quickly implicated in a series of financial crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, and he had no choice but to confess to try to reduce his sentence. The media reported the case as a major corporate scandal, revealing details that Clara had never imagined to be so profound. But the legal victory didn't bring the complete relief she had hoped for. Although the external threat had been eliminated, the chasm between her and Lucas seemed to grow by the day. Lucas, after the confrontation in the office, had kept a clear emotional distance. He was respectful but cold, and Clara knew that the bond between them had been severely damaged. One day, while organizing the remaining papers at home, she finally decided that she needed to face the inevitable. "Lucas," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "We need to talk." He looked up from a report he was reading, his expression neutral. "About what?" "About us," she said, taking a deep breath. "I know that what I did destroyed a lot. I know there may be nothing left to save, but I need to hear it from you. I need to know how to move on." Lucas was silent for a long moment, evaluating her words. "Clara," he began, his voice low but firm. "What happened between us wasn't an accident. It was a series of choices, yours and mine. I can recognize that my lack of attention contributed to the space you felt, but that doesn't justify what you did." Clara nodded, holding back tears. "I know that. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't expect you to forgive me, Lucas. I just want you to know that, despite everything, I still love you. And I always will." Lucas looked at her for a moment that seemed like an eternity. Finally, he sighed. "I believe that you love me, Clara. But love isn't enough to erase what happened. It's not just the betrayal. It's the fact that you put our whole lives at risk for someone who never really cared about you." His words hit Clara like a stab, but she knew he was right. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. Lucas hesitated before answering, but when he did, his voice was firm. "I need time, Clara. Time to rebuild my life. Maybe, one day, we can find a way to coexist, but right now, I can't." She nodded again, tears streaming silently down her face. Lucas got up, took the car keys and left, leaving Clara alone in the living room. She knew that this decision was necessary, but that didn't make it any less painful. In the months that followed, Lucas concentrated on rebuilding his life. He asked for a transfer at work, moving to another city. Away from the environment that brought back painful memories, he began to explore new possibilities. One evening, while attending a social event, he met Anna, a photographer who seemed to share his passion for simplicity and honesty. The relationship grew slowly, built on solid foundations, and Lucas finally began to feel some peace. Clara, for her part, decided to focus on herself. She left the company, determined to start again in a place where she wouldn't be defined by her mistakes. She got involved in volunteer work, helping people in vulnerable situations, as a way of dealing with her own guilt. Although she still felt Lucas' absence, she found new strength in her journey of redemption. As for Clara's former boss, his downfall was public and ruthless. He was sentenced to years in prison, and his reputation was destroyed forever. The victims of his financial schemes finally began to recover what they had lost, thanks to the evidence Clara and Lucas had provided. In the end, life went on for everyone, but with deep scars. Lucas found a new kind of happiness with Anna, learning to trust again. Clara, though alone, found purpose and redemption in her work, slowly rebuilding the woman she had been before her choices brought her down. This story reminds us that betrayal isn't just an isolated act, it's a deep shaking that can transform lives in irreversible ways. But it also shows that, even in the darkest moments, there is a chance to rebuild, to learn and to move on. Comment on what you thought of this story and share your opinion on the outcome. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, here, we never support any kind of betrayal. Our aim is to show how these choices can devastate lives. See you next time.